It is our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us.
And they decided that they were going to own all of the North American continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, from the Gulf up to Canada to the North Pole. That was part of their idea of manifest destiny. It just happened that on this land lived American Indians.
Between 1800 and 1860, the population of the United States soared from 5 to 31 million people. The country was young, literally. In the 1830s, 1 out of every 3 white Americans was under the age of 10. These young Americans were a people on the move. During those same 60 years, the United States more than doubled in size, pushing from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. For white settlers, American expansion meant progress and the chance for a new beginning. For Native Americans, it meant the loss of ancestral lands and the end of a way of life.
Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God.
Thomas Jefferson believed that those who tilled the soil were the backbone of the country, and that the future of the Republic should be a nation of independent farmers spreading across the continent. But in 1800, the U.S. ended at the Mississippi, and to the west stood the territories of France and Spain. Dreaming of a French New World Empire, Napoleon had acquired the vast Louisiana Territory from Spain. Control of the Mississippi River by the powerful French alarmed the United States, for the mighty Mississippi River linked the nation's western farmers to the world. French control of the port of New Orleans gave them a stranglehold on the United States frontier economy. But Napoleon's dream of a Western empire quickly turned into a nightmare. In the French colony of Haiti, Toussaint Louverture led a fierce rebellion of former slaves against French troops who died like flies from yellow fever. Back in France, Napoleon needed fast cash to support his wars of conquest in Europe. When American Minister James Monroe offered to purchase New Orleans for $10 million, Napoleon offered to sell the United States the entire Louisiana Territory, about 828,000 square miles, for just $5 million more. Nothing in the Constitution gave the president the power to purchase new lands, but Jefferson made the deal, doubling the size of the United States. In 1804, the president sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore and chart this vast, unknown territory. Departing from St. Louis, Missouri, Lewis and Clark headed west into lands few Europeans had ever seen. But they didn't go unprepared. They were trained like astronauts, briefed on things they might see and experience, told to do experiments, and record everything that seemed important in their exploration of this vast and unknown world. Lewis and Clark met more than 50 tribes, ranging from the peaceful Mandan Indians and the mighty Teton Sioux to the Shoshone relatives of their guide, Sacagawea. The Native Americans helped them through their travels, provided food, animal skin, and fur clothing, and advice on how to continue their trek westward. In the continent's interior, they discovered an unimagined world of natural wonder. Huge herds of bison, elk, and antelope roaming an inland ocean of grass, rivers teeming with fish, canyons of breathtaking beauty, and clouds of Montana mosquitoes so thick they could drive a man crazy. Lewis and Clark pushed westward and eventually reached the Pacific Ocean, where they established a camp and lived among the Chinook people and other coastal tribes of the Pacific Northwest. 2 years later, they returned east to Washington, D.C.
After the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1803, There were marvelous accounts and descriptions of the glories out there of the West. People were learning about the Rocky Mountains and the fabulous rivers and the Great Plains. And it was a huge continent they learned. An awful lot of land there. It seemed ripe for the taking.
Their glowing descriptions of abundant, fertile land and their detailed maps provided the signposts for a boom of westward migration. Some of the first whites to follow their lead were mountain men who trapped furs for distant markets, traded with Indians, and charted the best paths for movement across the continent. These were tough men, like Jedediah Smith, who found the South Pass through the Rocky Mountains. When his ear was nearly ripped off by the teeth of a grizzly bear, Smith had one of his men sew the ear back on. A few days later, Jedediah was back on the trail. Needing the cooperation and help of Western Indians, many trappers took Indian women for their wives, a practice encouraged by Indian leaders to cement alliances and trade with the whites. These paintings by George Catlin were some of the first glimpses Americans had of the people of the Western tribes. The western boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase were anything but clear, and no Indian nations had been party to the sale of lands which they claimed as their own.
As Americans expanded westward, the government of the United States was faced with new and very difficult issues. The most prominent was, of course, that Native Americans occupied many of those lands onto which American citizens were expanding. The government would grapple, often unsuccessfully, often with a conspicuous lack of justice, about what to do with those Indians occupying land that American citizens wished to move to.
When the first treaties were made, the fact that we could no longer just wander wherever we wanted or walk wherever we wanted, we had a real hard time grasping that. Everyone had to move. They said, why? It's because of this concept of manifest destiny. It meant that they could take our land without asking us, and that they could force us to move from our homelands.
In the Old Northwest arose a religious and political revival led by two Shawnee, the Prophet and his younger brother Tecumseh, who formed a powerful Indian confederation against white expansion.
Where are the Narragansett, the Mohican, and many other once powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man, as snow before a summer sun. Our lives are in the hands of the Creator. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it be His will, we wish to leave our bones upon them. Tecumseh.
Alarmed by the growing Indian alliance, Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison marched 1,000 troops and frontiersmen to the Tippecanoe River, where in 1811 he defeated the Shawnee in a bloody battle. The power struggle between England and its former colonies had not ended with the Revolution. While the Napoleonic Wars raged in Europe, the United States had become the largest neutral carrier of goods in the world. American merchants had grown rich carrying goods to markets previously denied to them by European nations. Both the French and British intercepted and confiscated American ships for trading with the enemy, but Americans considered the British the worst offenders. The Royal Navy took thousands of seamen from American vessels, many of whom had fled from British ships, and impressed them into its own service. The American desire for war was especially great among land-hungry Southerners and Westerners. Led by John C. Calhoun of South Carolina and Henry Clay of Kentucky, these war hawks accused Britain of still treating the United States like a colony and demanded that President Madison assert American independence by going to war. In 1812, they got their way when Congress declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 saw each side win its share of battles. Twice the Americans attempted to conquer Canada, torching the Canadian capital at York in 1813. The next year, the British retaliated by sacking Washington, D.C. and burning the Capitol and the President's mansion. Ironically, the United States' greatest victory came after the war was over. Before news of the war's end reached New Orleans, Americans repulsed a massive British assault and inflicted heavy casualties. The Battle of New Orleans had no effect on the peace treaty, but it did boost American spirits and made a national hero of General Andrew Jackson. 2 years of fighting had worn both sides out. The Treaty of Ghent returned the United States and Great Britain to the status quo ante bellum, or literally, the way it was before the war. But the war did have devastating consequences for the Indian nations which occupied lands claimed by American settlers. When the war broke out, Tecumseh had joined with the British. His death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 ended the Western Indian Alliance. The next year, Andrew Jackson, with the support of Cherokees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, crushed the Upper Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and forced them to give up 23 million acres of ancestral lands. Spain's once great New World empire was collapsing. One after another, the Spanish colonies in the Americas were winning their independence. Meanwhile, in North America, in 1819, Spain ceded both Florida to the United States and all Spanish territory north of the 42nd latitude, in exchange for $5 million and the end of American claims to the Spanish colony of Texas. In 1822, the United States became the first nation to extend formal recognition to the new independent countries of Latin America. Fearing European intervention in the new republics, President Monroe in 1823 issued a bold warning to European nations.
The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. James Monroe.
Although little more than an expression of principles, the Monroe Doctrine became the foundation of American foreign policy, championing a people's right to determine their own form of government. The noble principles expressed in the Monroe Doctrine did not apply to Indian nations living in lands claimed by or adjoining the United States. In the Northwest, troops crushed the resistance of the Fox and Sac Indians to white settlement at the Bad Axe Massacre in 1832. In the South, cotton planters lusted for the millions of acres of fertile lands occupied by the 60,000 members of what were known as the civilized tribes. The Cherokee were the largest and most Americanized of all Indian nations. They had their own written language and newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, started by Sequoyah in 1826. And they were successful farmers, some even using black slaves to grow tobacco and cotton. When the state of Georgia tried to pressure the Cherokee into selling their land, they declared themselves a republic and wrote their own constitution.
The Georgians are essentially, white Georgians, are harassing the Cherokees, trying to get into Cherokee land. And the Cherokees, who are by that time very assimilated, they're farming on plots that they own in a standard Western way. Lots of them are wearing European clothing. Lots of them are Christianized. They've gone about as far as they can go in terms of assimilating into American culture. And when the Georgians attack them and try to take their land, they do what good American citizens do, and they sue. And the case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Cherokees, which hands Andrew Jackson just what he wants, a chance to overrule the federal government on behalf of the state of Georgia. What's really going on there is that the Indians are getting caught in Andrew Jackson's struggle over states' rights.
Even though the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokees, President Jackson ignored the decision. In 1830, he urged the U.S. Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the government to buy out the 5 civilized tribes and resettle them west of the Mississippi River in an area called Indian Territory. Removal took place throughout the 1830s. In 1836, the American Army marched 15,000 Creeks, men, women, and children, many of them in chains and handcuffs, to their new homes in present-day Oklahoma. Between 1835 and 1838, thousands of Cherokees marched through snow and sleet with little clothing and at times no food. 4,000 died of disease, starvation, and exposure. These marches would forever be remembered as the Trail of Tears. Not all the civilized tribes gave in. In 1835, the federal government launched a long and costly war against the Seminoles in Florida, who had intermarried and lived with escaped slaves.
There was a young chief by the name of Osceola who decided that the government was being unjust, that the land belonged to his people, and he felt that he would not give up his land without a fight. According to the legend, Osceola walked forward in hushed silence. He pulled his hunting knife out, about 7 inches long, flashed it before the crowd, and shouted, "This is the only way I will sign." He then stabbed his knife through the treaty very violently, and this was the beginning of the Seminole War.
Defeat of the Seminoles marked the end of resistance east of the Mississippi. By 1844, removal had been completed in all but a few backcountry pockets of the South. Land. So much land that Thomas Jefferson estimated it would take 500 years to settle it all. Land in the West was the promise of America. An empire for liberty, Jefferson had called it, upon which self-sufficient farmers would extend a virtuous republic from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a grand dream, championed by Horace Greeley from the pages of his New York Tribune. Go west, young man, and grow up with the country. And by politicians like Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who promised free land for the homesteader as he lectured on a holy Anglo-Saxon mission to civilize the continent. Drawn by their dreams of a better life, folks packed their belongings into overstuffed, covered wagons and headed west in caravans containing as many as 200 wagons, 1,000 men, women, and children, and 3,000 to 4,000 head of cattle. The Oregon and California trails, at times little more than ruts in the dirt, ribboned over the land for 2,400 miles. The trip west was long and hard. Pioneers battled desert heat, mountain blizzards, rattlesnakes, swarms of insects, cholera and measles, thirst and starvation.
If you were a kid going west, you could probably find it both very exciting and very frightening. The chances are good that one or both of your parents would be dead by the time you got to California, and you would have to be absorbed into somebody else's family.
On hard and level ground, wagons could cover 20 miles a day, but rocky terrain and river crossings could slow the pace to less than a mile a day, as oxen strained, grunted, snorted, and brayed through swirls of choking dust, and drivers watched fearfully for Indians. False rumors of Indian attacks swept through the wagon trains. Sensational stories about savage Indians on the trails were popularized through literature and newspapers.
The Indians typically regarded the immigrants as trespassers, and they would try to collect a toll, or they wanted something from the immigrants in exchange for the grass and the use that the immigrants put on their land. The immigrants, of course, looked at this as begging and were often upset that they had to stop and make coffee or give the Indians flour or wheat. So oftentimes you'd have a lot of friction develop between the immigrants and the Indians. But typically, the relations were pretty good. And the idea that the Indians would attack wagon trains wholesale is pretty much a myth.
Of the 35,000 who died going west, shooting accidents killed far more people than Indians did.
One of the worst causes of death on the Overland Trail were gun accidents. We all think that these were brave frontiersmen crossing the plains, but very often the first gun they'd ever bought, they bought in Independence. And because they had very little experience with firearms, they'd often die pulling them out of the wagons. And it's probably about the third leading cause of death after disease, cholera, and other kinds of accidents.
The trip to Oregon took 4 to 6 months. Some groups left too late and got caught in the mountains in winter, and some got lost. The westward migrations brought Americans onto lands claimed by Spain, England, and dozens of Indian nations. Competing claims of sovereignty led inevitably to conflict and quickly became caught up in the raging national debate over slavery. In the American South, the desire for new lands for cultivation was the driving force of westward expansion. With English and northern factories buying all the cotton the South could provide them, planters pushed west across the Mississippi into Louisiana. By 1835, some 30,000 Americans were also living in the Mexican province of Texas.
The Mexicans invited United States citizens to settle in the northern Mexican territories, which at that point included Texas, on condition that the settlers would become Mexican citizens and would become at least nominally Roman Catholic.
When the Mexican government tried to exert greater control, the Anglos decided to form their own country. In March 1836, Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led an army of 5,000 men to suppress the rebellion and stormed an old abandoned mission called the Alamo in San Antonio. Though suffering some 1,500 casualties, Santa Anna's army wiped out nearly all 187 American defenders, including the legendary frontiersman Jim Bowie. Rallying to the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," Sam Houston and his Texas volunteers defeated the Mexicans and forced Santa Anna to sign a treaty granting Texas independence. After winning their independence from Mexico, the Texans petitioned for admittance to the United States, but to no avail. Northern congressmen had no intention of admitting yet another slave state into the Union. Believing that continued expansion was vital to the American South, President John Tyler, a Virginian who owned slaves, convinced Congress to annex Texas in March of 1845. Mexico quickly broke diplomatic ties to the United States, and both sides prepared for war. President Tyler's successor, James K. Polk of Tennessee, had run for president in 1844 on a promise of 54-40 or fight, which would have included Western Canada all the way up to the border of Alaska. Meanwhile, out in the Pacific Northwest, the United States and Great Britain were again fighting over borders to lands they had jointly administered for decades. Both lay claim to the resource-rich Oregon Territory. Anticipating war with Mexico, Polk accepted the British offer to divide Oregon at the 49th parallel. Mexico had never recognized the independence of Texas and became furious when the United States annexed the region. When President Polk offered $30 million for California and New Mexico, the Mexican government refused. In January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to cross the Nueces River and set up posts along the Rio Grande. Polk knew that Mexico claimed this territory and that his actions might lead to war. In April 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and briefly fought with American forces. President Polk reported to Congress that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. At his urging, Congress declared war on Mexico on May 13, 1846. It took only 6 months to conquer New Mexico and California. Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West marched from Kansas to Santa Fe and then on to Southern California. Meanwhile, Zachary Taylor pushed across the Rio Grande, captured the Mexican stronghold at Monterrey, and crushed Santa Ana at the Battle of Buena Vista in northern Mexico. Unable to force the Mexicans to surrender, Polk ordered the conquest of the Mexican capital of Mexico City. Commodore Perry took Veracruz by sea, and Winfield Scott stormed the castle at Chapultepec outside Mexico City, where Mexican cadets as young as 13 and 14 fought and died in defense of the Mexican capital. The war against Mexico divided Americans deeply. Many Northerners opposed the war on the grounds that it was a pro-slavery conspiracy. Anti-slavery writer James Russell Lowell accused the president of wanting bigger pens to cram with slaves. And a first-term congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln accused President Polk of starting an unnecessary and unconstitutional war against Mexico. Meanwhile, expansionists called Continental Democrats were encouraging the president to take all of Mexico. But support for annexing all of Mexico met stiff resistance. Many Americans did not want the United States to incorporate a Catholic nation of what they called mixed-race people. By the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States took about 1/3 of Mexico's territory, including all of modern California, Nevada, and Utah, most of New Mexico and Arizona, and a large portion of Colorado. 5 years later, Congress purchased the rest of the current-day continental United States from Mexico in the $10 million Gadsden Purchase. On Monday, January 24, 1848, James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill on the American River near Sacramento, California. This discovery set off a gold rush that attracted fortune seekers from around the world. Almost overnight, San Francisco was transformed from a sleepy port town of about 1,000 people to a booming city of 35,000. Out in the gold fields, a few of the 49ers got rich, but most didn't. Most of the placer, or surface gold, was quickly found. Soon, large-scale mechanized mining took over. Disillusioned, frustrated, and angry, the hordes of prospectors looked for someone to blame. The treaty ending the war with Mexico had guaranteed the citizenship and property rights of the Mexicans who fell under American rule. But in the 1850s, the California legislature passed special land laws that stripped Hispanics of their lands and special taxes against Chinese and Mexican miners who were beaten and driven from the mines. In a matter of years, gold fever had drawn California into the Union. In the coming decades, Western gold strikes would continue to spur settlement and play a major role in financing the nation's economic enterprises and industrialization.